Welcome to the City Club of Portland, Oregon's premier citizens forum. I'm Don Williams, president of City Club. Today's speaker will be Oregon Chief Justice Paul Muniz. He will be interviewed by Portland attorney Jim Westwood and City Club member Jim Westwood. For the benefit of our radio and television audience, please turn off your cell phones or other electronic devices. First, a few announcements. At our next Friday forum on June 15th, the speaker will be University of Oregon President Dave Frohnmeyer. He will speak on the importance of higher education and the serious challenges faced by the university system in Oregon. The 2007 Citizen Salon season is here. There's a brochure on the back in the back table about these. Please check your bulletin for the full lineup of upcoming dinner salons for the benefit of City Club. These are a great opportunity to be involved, and the list of guest presenters is very impressive. Kim McCool at the City Club office can take reservations for all the salons this summer, and space is limited. Agora will continue the exploration of sustainable design with a tour of technology-themed buildings June 14th at Portland State University. Join us and hear experts on sustainable technology and then take a guided tour of the PSU facilities. To sign up, please contact Kim. Growth in the City Club has been very strong. Last year we grew by 365 members, and today we have a number of 4 new members. Please join me in welcoming them. They will stand, and please hold your applause until all of them have been introduced. First one is Joe Smith. Joe is a leadership and development consultant and president of Smith Associates, Inc. Mary Ellen Hawkins-Smith, who's a principal at Westwood Farm Studio. Missy Pierce Oppenheimer, who is an attorney who practiced for 10 years in San Diego and moved to Portland just recently. And finally, Margaret Hoffman, who is a partner at Schwabe, Williamson & Wyatt. Please join me in welcoming them. We're extremely fortunate to have civic-minded sponsors. Our 2 sponsors this quarter are, and please join me in thanking Stoll Reeves, LLP, and Zimmer Gunsel and Frasca, LLP. Oregonians pride themselves on being leaders. Our land use system and the original Oregon Bottle Bill are just 2 examples. Oregon ranks very highly on everything, ranging from being one of the nation's best places to live to being one of the premier bike-friendly cities in the United States. It would seem, however, that Oregonians would not be proud of being at the bottom of any ranking unless it was something, a category like crime statistics. However, that's the current state of our judicial salaries, where Oregon ranks behind 49 other states and the District of Columbia. This will be one of the topics covered today by our speaker, the Honorable Paul Muniz. Many Oregonians might ask, why should I care about this issue? Is it any big deal that judges have not had raises for 5 years? Well, if one accepts the premise that all of us are customers, if you will, of the courts, it is a big deal. The courts don't just deal with abstract issues. Each case represents a crime victim, a complicated business dispute, or a serious domestic problem. The operations of the court has a material impact on both the quality of life and Oregon economics. Both business people and shareholders are concerned about organizational effectiveness and the ability of their corporations to recruit and retain key managers. How confident would they be if their corporation were ranked at the bottom of executive compensation? And does it make sense that an Oregon Circuit Court judge can drive across the Columbia River to Vancouver and make an additional $36,000 or 37% more in salary because of a geographical boundary. Are the legal issues in Washington that much more complex than in Oregon? The Chief Justice, among other responsibilities, is the administrative head of the Oregon courts. Judge Muniz will address today judicial salaries, court facilities, caseloads, and the impact of technology and how it's changed court operations. The Chief Justice is extremely well qualified for this position, having served on the Oregon Court of Appeals for over 10 years. He had a distinguished career as a trial lawyer in private practice and has a fascinating background, which includes teaching in the Russian university system. He grew up in Portland, attending Madison High School, went on and graduated from Portland State, and then attended law school. He is a Vietnam veteran. The Chief Justice runs every morning and loves coaching kids. He's mentored hundreds of teenagers to follow in his footsteps through his role as a mock trial judge. Jim Westwood will help us learn more about his career and his position on the court issues. I'm also proud to introduce Jim. Jim is a skilled appellate lawyer and a partner at Stoll Reeves LLP, which is also one of our corporate sponsors this quarter. Few City Club members can match the record of leadership and service of Jim. He has served on or chaired numerous research committees, the last one being the City of Portland Charter Amendments in 2007. In addition to his term as president in 1991, he served on the research board and club secretary. He joined the club in 1968, shortly after attending Portland State, and went on to graduate from Columbia University Law School. I might add that I'm also proud to say that Jim is a fellow alumnus of Oregon City High School, where his mom was my Latin teacher for 2 years. One part of Jim's history that many in the audience probably don't remember, or as Jim said, probably care about, but I think you will, is his former role as captain of the Portland State team for the GE College Bowl. The College Bowl was a nationally televised television program that went for 17 seasons, and the Portland State team captivated the entire state in 1965 when they won for 5 straight weeks. The team was coached by legendary Professor Ben Padro, and they were retired after they broke all existing scoring records. In fact, the Smith Memorial Center at Portland State is named after Michael Smith, a member of the team who died of cystic fibrosis in 1968. Jim, in honor of your mom, I was going to end my introduction with a short but very articulate Latin phrase, but our executive director, Wendy, who's also my lawyer at Friday Forums, ruled that out. So she gave me this script. Please welcome Chief Justice Paul Muniz and Jim Westwood.
If that was Latin, I understood it perfectly, Don. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope that what we can have today is something more than just a casual chat with the Chief Justice, but probably something less than a cross-examination. I'd like to start out by getting to know not just Chief Justice Muniz, but Paul Muniz, the person, the student, the lawyer, and later the judge. And then I'd like to move from there into some of the policy issues that are driving the state these days, in particular with respect to the judiciary. So with that roadmap, why don't we begin at an early age? Tell us about your early years, childhood, schooling, high school, into college.
Well, thank you, Jim, and it's a pleasure to be here and have the opportunity to look out and see so many friends in the audience. I was born in Glendale, California, but arrived in Oregon at 11 months old. So I think I'm pretty close to being a native Oregonian. I went to Harvey Scott Grade School in Northeast Portland, Madison High School, I enlisted in the U.S. Air Force a few months after I graduated from high school. I went to the Central Highlands of Vietnam in 1968, served a year in Vietnam, 1968 and 69. I was discharged from the Air Force in December of 1969, and I started at Portland State in January of 1970, and I graduated in June of 1972. People have asked me when I've used that statistic, is there anything you regret about your life? And I said, well, I would have liked to have gone to college. I went through undergraduate school fairly rapidly, was admitted immediately to Willamette, enjoyed my 3 years as a law student. In fact, my first 2 years as a law student were the first time in my life since I was 16 that I had not had a job and attended school full-time at the same time. So I really enjoyed the opportunity, finally, when I was 22, almost 23 years old, to attend and study full-time. And following law school, I started my career as a public defender in Salem.
Well, let's back up just a bit. What motivated you to get into the law in the first place?
Well, I was the first person in my family to graduate from college, and I think some of my experiences in the military caused me to understand the majesty and the power of the law. And I had the privilege of attending a constitutional law class when I was at Portland State, and that was what started me thinking about the law. And I started thinking about those very fundamental things that were important in our society, and it seemed to me that law provided that opportunity to really understand what made our country great and to make a difference in people's lives.
For the non-lawyers in the audience, I should mention that someone who goes into public defender work is not going into it for the money. There has to be some other motivation there. So what drew you into doing public defender work, and what happened after that?
Well, I think one of the things I tell young law students in particularly is many of us don't know what capabilities reside within us when we undertake a variety of experiences. And I had never spoken publicly in high school or college. When I was admitted to law school, I had no intention whatsoever of being a courtroom lawyer. I had no idea that I had any ability whatsoever to express myself in public or to be persuasive to a group of people. And I was fortunate enough to begin clerking as a third-year law student in the public defender's office, and I had the privilege of arguing in the Court of Appeals a homicide case when I was a third-year student. And it was the first time that the court had permitted that, and I was very fortunate to get the opportunity to argue that case, and I was successful, and that started me down that road.
How long were you with the public defender's office?
I spent 18 months in the public defender's office. Didn't like losing so much. And then I moved to private practice to a firm in Salem.
And what was the nature of your practice then?
My practice was civil litigation and criminal litigation in both state and federal courts.
Let me throw a little aside out here. Just before Justice Muniz went to the bench, I was on the other side of him on an appeal, and I vividly remember seeing his opening brief coming in over the transom, reading it and saying, "Oh my gosh, I've lost." It was really one of the finest, if not the finest brief I'd ever seen. Private practice lost someone when you went into the judiciary, but what's the path to the judiciary for you?
Well, again, I think it was an unusual path. I really had no intention or ever believing that I would become an appellate judge. But I had done a good deal of, for lack of a better word, I'll call it pro bono work. I argued a number of death cases on appeal, court-appointed cases, and My understanding, and this is just based on understanding, no one has ever explained this to me completely, but a couple of justices on the Supreme Court went to the current governor at that time when there was an opening in the appellate court and suggested me as a potential appellate judge.
Which governor was that? Who appointed
That was Governor Goldschmidt.
So you became a judge of the Oregon Court of Appeals directly from private practice then, is that right? Were there any surprises when you became a judge, things you really hadn't expected? Maybe you would be careful what you ask for?
I think one of the things that, a misimpression I had as a lawyer was that in the appellate courts, I thought as a lawyer that advocacy may not have, the ability of an advocate and written expression of the lawyers may not have been so important because the appellate judges had the opportunity and had the time to look at all the arguments, unlike a trial judge who had to make a snap decision. And so I thought that maybe appellate advocacy, the individual capabilities of the lawyer may not be as important. And what I learned immediately was advocacy counts. Even in the appellate courts, the ability of advocates to persuade and to analyze the law is extremely important to us on the appellate bench.
Did you find as a judge that you became isolated from your former colleagues, or were you able to stay in touch and maintain ties there so you weren't so lonesome?
Well, I think one of the other things that's been different for me than most of my colleagues is I'm one of the few lawyers who went to the appellate bench from Salem, person who had a practice in Salem and then just walked down the street from my office to the appellate court. And as a result, of course, my wife and I were fully invested in our community. I'd been a soccer coach, Little League coach, mock trial coach, had been active in the community in many other civic organizations. And so for me, it really didn't change my life. Obviously, there were certain things that I couldn't discuss with my former colleagues, but that's a very little inhibition.
So you were appointed to the court, and then in the next election, under the law of Oregon, you were required to run for election to the court. This might be a nice time for a little digression from the biographical progression to some thoughts on the elected judiciary in Oregon. Mm-hmm. This is what we've had since 1859, and it remains in place. Sometimes people say we need to reform it. Sometimes people say, no, we got to keep it exactly the way it is. Do you have some thoughts you'd care to share with us on that?
Well, thank you, Jim. I do have some thoughts, and I noticed that my colleague, Justice Balmer, just walked in the audience, and the reason I mention his name is we share the same affinity for Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. And the reason I talk about the great justice is that one of my favorite stories about Justice Holmes is a book called Touched by Fire, which is a collection of Justice Holmes's letters home to his parents during the Civil War. And my reason for bringing that up is I ran for the Oregon Supreme Court in 2000 and had the experience of being touched by fire. And it had such a profound impact on me. I actually sat down and wrote a law review article about judicial elections in Oregon and throughout the country. And justices in the highest courts are elected in 39 states. Most of those are enshrined in the Constitution and were enshrined there during the Jacksonian period when people thought it was very important to elect people to every position in government. And that system worked well until there was a recognition. And you ask, well, what took people so long to realize that many of the most powerful people in state government are those who sit on the state's highest court? And all you have to do is look at our own court for that. We decided, for example, in the last 2.5 years or 3 years, we've decided issues regarding PERS reform, public employee retirement reform. We've had questions regarding same-sex marriage, expression cases, freedom of expression cases, one involving Mr. Westwood. It occurred, I think, to many special interest groups throughout the country that people ought to be concerned about who served on the state's highest court. And as a result, we've reached what I would consider to be the perfect storm throughout the country in judicial elections. And there are 3 legs to that stool. First of all, we have an unprecedented amount of special interest financing of judicial campaigns. And the reason I bring that up is that our judicial system works because the public has confidence over some 219 years, 220 years, in the impartiality and fairness of the judicial system. But when you put the kind of money that goes into state judicial campaigns now by special interest groups, you run the risk of eroding the public's confidence in the impartiality of those that they elect. And I think that's a serious problem. The second is, while we've had dissatisfaction with the administration of justice since we've had law, I think we're at a time in our history where we've had unprecedented attacks on the courts from all sides. And our federal courts, the United States Supreme Court, in a case called Minnesota versus White, ruled that judicial candidates basically are free to express their views about the law, to make pronouncements about how they might rule in particular cases, their views about hot-button issues like the death penalty, abortion, what it might be. I'm particularly I've read that case very carefully because Justice John Paul Stevens, who dissented in that case, cited extensively from my law review article. So I favor the dissent. So we have those 2 parts of the stool, and the third is really we have a civic education problem in this country. We no longer teach civics in 38 states. A recent survey by the ABA revealed that only, I think it was 55% of the people surveyed were unable to identify the 3 branches of government. 22% of those in that same survey identified the 3 branches of government as Republican, Democrat, and Independent. Our framers knew that a constitutional democracy to succeed and to continue and to endure requires an educated populace. And we have a problem with our civic education throughout the country, and that permits the kind of ad hominem attacks on courts. Certainly, courts are not above criticism. Individual judges and courts should be accountable. They should be subject to public criticism, but not the kind that is based solely on political views and not on what I would consider to be purely judicial accountability matters. And I'm afraid that in the past, a lot of things that have gone on, a lot of different kinds of measures, for example, that have been introduced. We'll take one in South Dakota, for example, that was called Jail for Judges, that was on the ballot in North Dakota last November, would have created a 4th branch of government and stripped judges and other public officials of immunity. These are things that strike at the very core of our intention that we separate politics from judicial adjudication.
Wow. Let me add. No, that was very good. I just want to add one other thing, too, that Oregon at least attempts, some individual judges in Oregon, many of whom I have talked to about this. Of course, we do have judicial elections, and I'd like to get to that in a moment, too, your ascension to the Supreme Court. But several of our judges, even though the contribution and expenditure lists of who gives money to support a judge in the election are public records, there are many judges, and I suspect one sitting close to me is one of those, who do not look at that list. They do not want to have even the appearance of any impropriety on it. So that's a good sign that, at least in some respects, the Oregon judiciary is very much alive, well, and clean. You mentioned that you had run for the Supreme Court. Now, this was an opposed, an open seat. You had a formidable opponent, and you won election. Why would you want to be on the Supreme Court? I'm told the Court of Appeals is a wonderfully collegial court. I know some of the Court of Appeals judges say, I'd never want to be on that Supreme Court. What took you in that direction?
Well, thank you, Jim. First of all, I should disclose that Mr. Westwood was on my campaign committee. So that's a complex question. I really enjoyed my tenure on the Court of Appeals. And had I not done anything else but served on the Court of Appeals, I would have felt fulfilled in my legal career. I enjoyed the judges there. I enjoyed the lawyers in the day-to-day give and take in that court. It's a wonderful, wonderful court and recognized nationally as one of the best intermediate appellate courts in the country. I chose to run because I had a feeling that reaching age 60, which is I did today, thank you. My wife told me this morning I didn't look a day over 59. So, knowing myself, and it was something that stayed with me from Vietnam, was this: I felt very privileged, even as a young man, when I was 20 years old in Vietnam, that if you were fortunate enough to survive this, you had to think about what your life would be like later, and what you would think about what you had done, and whether you had lived up to whatever capabilities you had. And so I decided I needed to test myself. I wanted to experience it. I wanted to do my best. I wanted to do it my way. And I thought it would, and I truly believed when I went into it that I would learn something from the process about myself, about the legal profession, and about the courts, and I did. It was a grueling 18-month experience. There were 5 lawyers in the primary, and I was fortunate enough to win the primary and then win the runoff election in a very hotly contested election. I thought, and I think I could answer this correctly whether I won or lost, I believe it made me a better judge, because when I started traveling around the state to talk to groups like this, I had to be able to stand up in front of groups and honestly say, what was my judicial philosophy? What did my record show? What did those 850 opinions that I had written in 9.5 years on the Court of Appeals say about the law and say about me? And it caused a great deal of introspection, helped me to refocus myself and find some of my judicial values that I had not really thought about in a while. So it was a crucible of sorts, and I survived it.
Now, I don't think many people outside of the law are aware of the fact that in Oregon, unlike in the federal branch where the Chief Justice is appointed to that position by the President, as Chief Justice Roberts was, in Oregon, the justices, as I understand this, elect their own chief. And what made you decide you might want to have that position? You should really be careful what you ask for.
Well, I never anticipated being Chief Justice. I was very happy doing the work of an Associate Justice, which is wonderful. Was able to do my work timely, during that period I had traveled to Russia 3 different times, taught in Russia, put together a textbook on criminal procedure. So I was perfectly happy. My colleagues asked me to consider doing that, and I chose to do that.
And so now you're Chief Justice, and what's the effect of that job on your relations with your colleagues?
Well, I think I have to answer that question, Jim, this way. I feel very privileged to have the colleagues that I have on the Supreme Court. I'll just set some milestones for us. This is the first time in Oregon's history that we have had 2 women serving on the Oregon Supreme Court simultaneously. And I can say without fear of contradiction from my colleagues that in their short tenure, they have already made a tremendous impact and difference on our court. So our relationship, I think, remains pretty much the same, except that I have the opportunity, and this is something that I had told my colleagues when they elected me to this position, that if they wanted me to be Chief Justice, I would not be a caretaker, that I would not just preside over the court as a caretaker, but during the tenure for which I was elected, I wanted to try to bring this branch of government into the 21st century. And there are a variety of factors that go into that, but I meant that most sincerely. And that the change that I anticipated happening needed to begin in the Supreme Court itself.
And there are many ways, of course, that that is being brought about, and one of them, case management, I know. How's that been affected?
Well, let me, if I could back up just a bit and say, I'd like to just talk about some basics of our constitutional system and relate it to your question. The judicial branch of government has no power to fund its own operations and no power to carry out its own orders. We have to rely on the other 2 branches of government. We have to rely on the legislature to fund our operations and the executive branch to carry out our orders. So if you go back to those basics and you think about this, why does our constitutional democracy work? And most people would say it works because the other 2 branches of government and the public acquiesce to judicial power. President Nixon turned over the tapes. Truman rescinded the executive order nationalizing the steel industry. There are other examples. So in order for the judicial branch to be able to fully perform its constitutional role, we have to maintain the public's confidence and we have to maintain the legislative branch's confidence because we have to look for them to fund our own operations. When I became Chief Justice, I embarked on a tour of the courthouses throughout the state. It was time for an audit, if I could use those terms, to find out where we were. I was joking, this is a sort of a joke, but I was telling a group that I was speaking to the other day that if you think about it, who is really less informed and who less ought to be Chief Justice than an Associate Justice? And let me explain what I mean. Who's more isolated than the Associate Justices on the court? I had been an appellate judge for 17 years. I had not been in a trial courtroom in 17 years. So the first thing I needed to do was visit those courthouses and those courtrooms around the state and determine what is the state of the judiciary in January of 2006. And I came away with these conclusions. First, we have 1,800 employees and nearly 200 judges who are exceedingly dedicated, competent, and efficient in the work they do. They are dedicated to this court system. That was the good news. The bad news was that we have an infrastructure problem, that our courthouses are in a state of disrepair, and in need of physical upgrading, electronic upgrading. And, as was reported earlier, our judges are the 51st worst paid in the country. Those statistics don't bode well for one who wants to make sure that this branch of government performs its constitutional role. So that takes us to where we are now in an answer to your question. Let me start with technology. Right now, the Oregon courts use a legacy 20-year-old COBOL system. I see many shocked faces out there. We need to bring the judicial branch of government into the 21st century. We're 20 years, the system we're using is 20 years past its time. It's been a good system, and we've made it work in a variety of circumstances, but it is not an automated system. We need to be able, in our court system, we need to have electronic data management, in other words, electronic content management. We need to have electronic case management, and we need to have electronic filing. Those are the three things that sort of would be at the basis of a new system. What I would like us to do, I want to build the largest courthouse in Oregon. I want to build the e-courthouse, where people can interact with the court system 24 hours a day from anywhere in the world. And I can give you a variety of examples, but let me just use myself. Let's suppose that I made a visit to Burns, and out in one of those flat stretches out there, I went too fast and got a speeding ticket. I ought to be able to get home, turn on my computer, and I ought to be able to take care of that ticket from anywhere in the state over the internet. We can't do that today. So that part of technology we need to go forward with. And we have a plan to do that. The legislature has a very large role to play in helping us get there. They need to fund it. And of course, I understand their need to make sure that we have appropriate safeguards and governance in place. But I have charged the State Court Administrator's Office with getting us to this position in 5 years.
Let me just clarify that when Justice Muniz said he would take care of the ticket, he meant he'd pay the fine. Well, you've...
Thank you, Jim. You're a good lawyer.
Glad to be of service. You've touched on judicial salaries and the electronic courthouse. I know you've talked about a third leg as well, or a third issue, that being the number of judgeships in the state, statewide, and I think you'd also talked about facilities as well in the past. So could you talk a little bit about those problems we have?
I'd be happy to. I probably don't need to tell any of you in this room today about the state of the Multnomah County Courthouse. Many of you have been there, and you know that there are architectural studies that indicate that with a Category 6 earthquake, it would crumble. We've built one new courthouse in Oregon since 1967, and that is a wonderful, beautiful courthouse in Klamath Falls. We had to do that because the other one fell down in an earthquake. So our courthouses are in severe need of upgrade, expansion, or replacement. But we have to be very sensitive to the idea that one size does not fit all. In many communities in Oregon, the courthouse is the center of civic activities. It's a multiple-use facility. People are very invested in that image. And while I'm talking about the image of our courthouses, let me tell you why I think it's so important. The state capitol stands as a monument to the executive branch and the legislative branch as the seat of government. For the court system, those courthouses in the 36 counties in Oregon and the 27 judicial districts are supposed to stand as a symbol that justice is available to everyone, everywhere. That's not the case, and I have a personal experience to demonstrate that. When I arrived in January in a snowstorm in Canyon City to go into the Grant County Courthouse, I was informed there that they had started a trial. The courtroom was on the second floor. They had started a trial in the courtroom, and they had to recess that trial and move it to another state building on ground level because they had no elevator, and the victim of that case was a quadriplegic, and they could not get her, they had no elevator, they could not get her upstairs to that courtroom to testify. That courthouse does not stand as a symbol that justice is available to everyone, everywhere. So this is a serious problem. The counties own the court facilities. The state does not own them. We are tenants there. And as a result of my experiences there, I put together a task force that included the county representatives, representatives of the bar and of the judicial branch, and we met for nearly a year and wrote a very lengthy task force report, submitted it to the legislature, introduced legislation, and there is a Senate Bill 2331 now that, if it were to finally pass, will create a statutory commission to study the extent of our court facility problem, to engage architects and the kind of professionals that are necessary to truly understand what is the magnitude of this infrastructure problem we have. And I've been working with Senate leadership and the governor's office, and I believe that bill will pass and that we will have an opportunity over this biennium for the first time to actually study this problem for the good of all Oregonians.
In a representative democracy, public confidence in a visible judiciary is, of course, very important because citizens like us elect our representatives who ultimately pass the appropriations for the judicial branch. What things is the court doing, and what can we as citizens do to help the court become more effective in that regard?
Thank you, Jim. As I mentioned earlier, our branch of government cannot fund its own operations, and we have to rely on the legislative branch to do that. In my view, what we need to do as a branch of government is we need to maintain the public's confidence and the legislature's confidence by showing at least two things. First, that we're prudent managers of the resources that the legislature provides to us, just like any business or any other institution. And that has to begin with me, and it has to begin with the Supreme Court. We have to show that we are good producers of the work that we're assigned to do. And that means, as judges, whether you're serving on the Supreme Court, the Court of Appeals, or the trial court, that we do our work competently and efficiently, that we treat all litigants respectfully, and that we continue to always examine our decision-making processes to make sure that we're always conscious of the limited role that the Constitution assigns to us as the judicial branch of government. And when I embarked on as Chief Justice and carried this message to the other courts, I of course realized that in order to do that, we have to set the example in the Oregon Supreme Court. We have to show that we're good producers of the work that we're assigned to do. And I'm very pleased to report that in 2006, my colleagues produced the most written opinions that our court had produced in over a decade. And I'm pleased to say that today, for the first time in over a decade, our court is current. And what I mean by that is we have no cases under advisement other than ones that were argued this term. So we're trying to set that example of what it means to be competent, efficient, and good producers of your work.
We have just a little time remaining. We have just a little time remaining, but I'd like to change gears a little bit as we wind down and ask you if you wouldn't mind. You don't have to talk about this, but we were having lunch not long ago together, and Chief Justice Muniz mentioned something that happened at 7:30 this morning that I think will warm your hearts.
Well, my wife and I are very fortunate that our 3 grown children actually have returned and live in Salem. And so my wife's doing some remodeling, and so she told me, because I had a meeting in Portland here earlier before this one, she said, well, I've asked the interior decorator to come at 7:30. Whoa, okay. So as I was dressing upstairs, I looked out and I saw a car in the driveway. My wife and I had gone through this whole thing about, did you want a birthday party because you're turning 60? And I'd said, no, I don't want any parties. I just want to have a good day. And long story short, I'm the last to find out, but all of my children had arrived secretly, and when I walked downstairs, they'd been very quiet. They had prepared breakfast for me.
Well, in a state like Oregon, the Chief Justice will come speak to City Club on his birthday, his 60th birthday at that, and tell us some wonderful things and some things that really will require our engagement and involvement. Let me suggest to City Club members present today and to our radio audience that really the citizens of the state do need to step up and support this branch of the government as it supports the others so that we can have a truly effective state government. I want to thank you personally, Chief Justice Muniz, for taking the time and for agreeing to do this on behalf of City Club today.
Thank you, Jim, and I'd like to thank all of you here in the City Club for giving me the opportunity to be here. It's been just a great pleasure.
We now have time, about 15 minutes, for question and answers. Asking questions is a privilege of City Club membership. I might add that a synonym for question is inquiry rather than statement. Your question should be restricted to 30 seconds, and it should end with a question mark rather than an exclamation point. I might also add that if you go over your limit, your 30-second limit, Jim will tell you you're out of order with the backing of the Chief Justice. Today's first question will be asked by our board host, John Horvick. John is co-chair of the New Leaders Council and received the City Club President's Award in 2006. He is the project director of the Parents and Children Together study at OHSU. He graduated from the University of Minnesota and joined City Club in 2004.
Thank you for joining us today. I'm interested in the court's diversity, and I was struck today when you mentioned that we now have 2 women on the Supreme Court that the audience applauded. Can you please say more about your thoughts about the court's diversity, be it gender, racial, geographic, ideological, on the Supreme Court, and importantly, how do you think voters should consider Supreme Court when they're selecting justices?
That's it. I was just thinking about what the lawyers must think when I ask a question like that, John, that has many parts. Thank you. First of all, with regard to the diversity question, I think as my earlier answer to Mr. Westwood indicated, diversity makes a big difference in any institution. The courts are no different. Our courts as an institution ought to reflect the society that we serve. And that means that it ought to reflect the backgrounds, ethnicities, points of view that exist in our very diverse society today. And every institution benefits from people from different backgrounds and walks of life. And I think it's quite telling how important that is. The difference between my background, for example, and some of my other colleagues is stark. And we're all shaped by our backgrounds. We all, I'm pleased to say, of course, on our courts, we have a fidelity to the law, but we are all part of the backgrounds, the families, the whatever we have that brings us to that. So I think it's an exceedingly important point. I will say that this problem, if we want to call it a problem, diversity is not something you can achieve, particularly in the legal profession, the court system, overnight. We have to interest various communities in our society, in the legal profession, and we have to reach into the grade schools and high schools to start doing that. I could mention one program that I'm affiliated with and that I think is a wonderful program. Willamette University has a program called Willamette Academy. And Willamette Academy has been operating, I think, for 5 years now. And it reaches into the communities in Salem and selects these young people, and it's a holistic view. It includes their families. And it reaches into these, to ethnic minorities, socioeconomic groups, and it brings kids into this program who would not normally be on the path to college because of their socioeconomic situation. And I'm pleased to say that they have their first graduating class from high school, and out of 22 that have graduated, I believe that 15 of them are will be enrolled in college in the fall. And it's that kind of program that reaches into those different segments of our society that will help to continue to make our legal profession and the court system reflective of the increasingly diverse society that we have.
B.J. Seymour, City Club member. I have a short question for Jim Westwood and a longer one for the Chief Justice. Jim, did the speaker get to see the questions in advance? I didn't hear much hemming and hawing, and you seemed very smooth. Did you show him what you were going to ask?
I did give him a general outline, but I guarantee you some of these questions were blindsides.
The larger question, Mr. Chief Justice, you mentioned your concern about special interest funding in judicial elections. I need to know how much of a problem this is. How many judicial elections, particularly at the Supreme Court level, are contested? Aren't most of them, or at least a substantial percentage, uncontested?
Thank you. Nationally, in the 39 states in which judges to the highest courts are elected, the number of contested elections have been increasing rapidly over the last 10 years. So that's number one. We've been very fortunate in Oregon, and I would like to congratulate publicly Justice Linder and Jack Roberts for the campaigns that they conducted. I was involved with them in brokering an election agreement in which they voluntarily agreed to follow certain guidelines in their campaigns. And so we had a wonderful election here, but that's not the case in other states.
Kurt Wavering, member. As you know, the City Club does public policy research, and we now have an advocacy committee whose task it is to see that the recommendations in the research reports get acted upon. So I'm wondering if advocacy to the judicial branch in some way might be an appropriate role and activity for the City Club.
It's a wonderful question. Obviously, I don't know exactly what someone would have in mind, but I can say this, that the judicial branch of government needs public outreach. We're working very hard ourselves to do that, but the more groups who support the role of the courts in our constitutional democracy can only be a good thing.
Jim Zarin, City Club member. I heard you describe the perfect storm of considerations that you think are of concern about the election process. I thought that was going to lead to a statement of what your preferred alternative is, which I assume would be appointment. But I didn't really hear that. And then I also noticed that you mentioned that having to go and speak throughout the state as part of the election process was very important, and you thought it made you a better judge. So I'm wondering what your real position is on election versus appointment, and how that maybe squares with your comment about the importance of speaking to people throughout the state during the election process.
Thank you. May I answer? My position is in flux, and I treat that correctly. I do think here's the difficulty that, as I see it. First of all, as the leader of the judicial branch of government, my time over the last 18 months has been devoted primarily to the branch. And I think I've described my efforts to try to increase the visibility of the branch, to secure confidence with the legislature, recognizing that we interact and negotiate every day with the legislative branch of government. With regard to this very fundamental question about elections, in the last 20 years, in each state in which the public has been asked to determine by vote whether they want to change from popular election of judges to some other merit selection process, every one of those efforts have been defeated at the polls, coupled by a post-election survey in which those voters admit they don't know who they're voting for. So it's a complex question. What I think I would like to do is we have an organization called the Oregon Law Commission, which I think is a kind of think tank and place where this issue should probably have its origin and percolate to start looking to see, is there a better method? I probably would favor some kind of merit selection process. I would favor extending the tenure of judges. We have the shortest tenure for judges in any state in the country. 6 years is the shortest. I would probably want to change the tenure to a lengthier period of time in the hope that by changing that tenure, we would be able to draw more experienced lawyers, thinking that then they would serve one term, at one 10-year term or 12-year term or whatever it might be. One of the things I'd like to say, if I could expand on this just a little bit, the question about this election is also related in an interesting way to the question about judicial salaries. This question on judicial salaries is not about me. It's not about my salary or about the judges who are serving today. It's about those who will come after us. It's about being able to recruit and retain some of the best and brightest lawyers into a career in judicial service. And if we don't return to paying some sort of market-driven compensation, we will no longer be able to do that. So I see these sort of working together, and we need to tackle both of these things. So, thank you.
I'm sorry we're out of time for additional questions. Mr. Chief Justice, happy birthday, and thank you very much. Jim, thank you. We're adjourned.